Welcome to First Do No Harm with Massachusetts Citizens for Life board member and physician Dr. Mark Rollo. This broadcast will focus on medical ethics from a Catholic perspective and address abortion, physician-assisted suicide, contraception, natural family planning, IVF, healthcare proxy, and other topics. Please be advised that this show may not be appropriate for children under 13.
Hello and welcome back to First Do No Harm, a show about medical ethics from a Catholic perspective. I'm Dr. Mark Rollo. On June 24th, 2022, a day that future generations will remember as the day the United States of America started to regain its sanity, the Supreme Court of the United States reversed the infamous Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. After nearly 50 years of the slaughter of the innocents, we have begun to restore our legal and moral bearings. Millions of preborn babies will no longer be indiscriminately killed. Inconvenient life will no longer be snuffed out with impunity. Death will cease to be a constitutional solution for a social problem. Truly, this is a time for celebration. However, just as millions of innocent human beings will be saved, millions more will be considered disposable. The atrocity of abortion will continue unabated in states like California, New York, and Massachusetts. And so we in the Bay State have our work cut out for us. In many ways, our work has become even more arduous. Today I will play part one of my recent interview with Andrew Beckwith, president of Massachusetts Family Institute, an organization dedicated to strengthening the well-being, health, and safety of families, including the unborn, in Massachusetts. We actually have many family issues to discuss, but first and foremost will be our discussion of the massive victory of relegating Roe v. Wade to the ash heap of history. Before we continue, let us pray. For as stated by the U.S. Catholic bishops, only with prayer that storms the heavens for justice and mercy, prayer that cleanses our hearts and souls, will the culture of death that surrounds us today be replaced with a culture of life. Matthew chapter 2, verses 16 to 18 reads this way. When Herod realized that he had been deceived by the Magi, he became furious. He ordered the massacre of all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity, 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had ascertained from the Magi. Then was fulfilled what had been said through Jeremiah the prophet. A voice was heard in Ramah, sobbing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children, and she would not be consoled, since they were no more. O God, save us from the fear and jealousy that leads us to seeking solutions which devalue and destroy life. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. And now here is part one of my conversation with Andrew Beckwith, president of Massachusetts Family Institute. Joining me now is Andrew Beckwith. Andrew Beckwith is the president of Massachusetts Family Institute, which was established in 1991 and is dedicated to strengthening families in Massachusetts according to Judeo-Christian principles. Andrew is a graduate of Gordon College and of the University of Minnesota Law School. He serves as an allied attorney with Alliance Defending Freedom, focusing on religious liberty cases. He also serves as a judge advocate in the United States Marine Corps Reserves, where he holds the rank of lieutenant colonel. Prior to going to Massachusetts Family Institute, He litigated immigration cases for the Boston office of the Department of Homeland Security. Andrew, his wife Karen, and their 4 children live in Wenham, Massachusetts. So welcome, Andrew. Thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me on, Doctor. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
I am really excited. There's so much going on, and I'm excited to talk with you from your perspective as a lawyer about a number of things that are going on and that Massachusetts Family Institute is involved with. And the very first thing I want to talk about is the recent Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade and overturning Casey versus Planned Parenthood. The reversal of Roe and Casey was no less, in my opinion, than a legal and cultural earthquake. And I'll tell you my initial reaction. I'd love to get your initial reaction, but I was just elated. I was ecstatic. My mother fought this for her whole adult life, and she passed away about a year ago at the age of 99 and never got to see this day. But you know, we stand on the shoulders of people like her that fought for decades to get this overturned. And one thing kept reverberating in my mind every time, and this is the patriotic time of year with the 4th of July and so forth and Flag Day, and every time I heard the America the Beautiful, I thought of the line, God mend thine every flaw. And every time I heard that song, I had abortion in mind. I had Roe v. Wade in mind. And so it's just wonderful that I can sing that song and say, thank you, God, for mending this grievous flaw. So I wonder how this decision struck you when it came down.
Well, I mean, of course, the first I saw it was in the Leak decision, and so kind of some of the confusion and chaos that accompanied a Leak's decision, which is essentially unprecedented.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of my initial reaction of, is this thing real? I mean, can we get it?
Yeah.
And I tended to be, I didn't think the court would actually do it. I mean, I know a lot of people had their hopes up and have been working very hard for this, but you know, we've been burned so many times on so many fronts. So I was just sort of surprised, and then I finally read Alito's decision and just thought, man, if this thing holds up, if this is what is actually issued, and it essentially was, this is a tremendous victory.
Yes.
And yes, sets to right decades worth of bad law and bad precedent.
Yeah, and speaking of bad law and bad precedent, I wonder if we can just kind of go through how ridiculous this law was and how convoluted the reasoning was from the beginning, as Alito mentioned. He said it was egregious from the beginning. And he reviewed how initially they spoke of the Supreme Court justices in 1973, spoke about the penumbra of privacy. You know, that the shadow of privacy is never, a right to privacy is never mentioned in the Constitution. But they kind of said that there is sort of this implication, and they invoked the First Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fourth, the Fifth, the Ninth. They were really searching, and then finally the 14th Amendment to justify Roe. And then after that, they said, well, now we have stare decisis. In other words, we've already decided, and so we can't really easily reverse it. Then came Casey about 20 years later in 1992, and they focused on the 14th Amendment and the so-called undue burden test. In other words, you couldn't put a woman through the undue burden of obtaining, going through steps before obtaining an abortion.
Right.
And then even in the Dobbs case, Justice Roberts tried to apply another vague test and said, well, we're not going to use viability. We're not going to use undue burden. We're going to say a woman needs a reasonable opportunity to obtain an abortion. And he wanted to keep Roe and Casey. And fortunately, these 5 brave justices said, no, this is terrible law. Right. And so what kind of was your thinking about reviewing Alito's decision?
Well, I mean, he's exactly right, and saying that you can't have a due process right to something that is not only not in the Constitution,
right,
but it does not have sort of a long-standing tradition. It's not part of the common law.
Exactly.
And essentially it said this whole idea of substantive due process, now this is getting kind of deep in the weeds, but the idea of substantive due process that Roe and its progeny were hanging on at this point needs to just be done away with because it doesn't actually exist. Which makes sense if you think about it, right? I mean, you have procedural rights and substantive rights, or right to the proper process, and then actual rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, property, those types of things. And a substantive due process right is is trying to create substance out of process. And the two things are separate. So just kind of like the original Roe decision, we're going to mash together a bunch of different rights that and case law that don't really apply, and that hopefully the whole will be greater than the sum of its parts. But that's not how the law is supposed to work, and that the right's either there or it's not. And Alito correctly pointed out that this is not something we have had historically. There's no common law right to abortion, and it's not in the Constitution, so we can't just invent that out of whole cloth. And it's frankly sort of satisfying to see that, because thousands and thousands of law students, we had to go through law school learning Roe v. Wade and reintroduce decisions, and they're kind of hard to take seriously because it becomes pretty obvious, just like with the Obergefell decision and others, that this is a policy decision, that the judges in the majority wanted to come to this decision, and they're just going to throw some legal gobbledygook on paper to make it work. I know it sounds pretty cynical, but
that's true.
And even Roberts, who has lost his spine by and large, well, he's sort of typical of what we used to get from Republican appointees.
Exactly.
Is justices who would write great conservative dissents, when it's safe, when it doesn't matter. But are scared to be in the majority. That's kind of how I see Roberts. So his dissent in Obergefell was great, and it was correct. And it said, I know a lot of people are celebrating right now that there's this newly found right to same-sex marriage, but it is without basis in the Constitution.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that kind of gets to Justice Thomas's opinion, and I like Justice Thomas. Well, I loved Alito's opinion, and his was the opinion of the court, and it was a much longer. But Justice Thomas kind of reviewed the fact that these other cases that were sort of precedent and also antecedent to Roe v. Wade should be considered too. So this whole right to privacy, he argues that it started with Griswold, and Griswold was the case that said, invoking a so-called right to privacy where married people could have contraception. Because before 1965, I think it was actually illegal. And so Griswold overruled that, said, no, there's a right to privacy in the Constitution. You can't do that. And then they went on to the Eisenstadt, which says, well, not only can you not keep married people from having contraception, you can't keep anybody from having contraception. And then that led to, my understanding anyway, is the Lawrence case in Texas, where they said, well, we can't make any kind of sex act, sodomy. They struck down sodomy laws in the Lawrence case did in Texas. And then finally, as you mentioned, Obergefell said that you can't even say that a marriage should be between a man and a woman. So he just makes the case that we can't keep hiding, as he put it, we can't keep hiding new rights in the so-called due process and the equal protection clause. What are your thoughts about?
No, I agree.
Thomas?
He's totally correct, and it's still amazing to think that they've actually taken that first big step with undoing Roe v. Wade and essentially doing away or signaling that they want to do away with substantive due process.
Yeah,
and these sort of invented rights by the court. Unlike the abortion issue, and at the moment there's not that I'm aware of. But there's not this big groundswell of legal challenges to Obergefell. You don't have states passing various types of marriage restrictions, trying to chip away at Obergefell. So I don't know how we would get back to the court on that in the near future. Hopefully there are people out there working on it. that have. I know some people do have some plans, but it's there's not that sort of
Yeah.
infrastructure and history and strategy that you have with Roe.
Mm-hmm.
But it's great to see that the court is coming back to the Constitution
Right.
to be a document that has the more predictable and reliable, even though it's a big sea change right now. But
Yeah.
sometimes you have to do that to get back to the truth.
Yeah. Well, lest anybody forget, the 14th Amendment, which was being used for a long time to invent
Yeah.
rights, was initially ratified in 1868, and the reason for it was slavery. It was
Right.
He was saying you can't deprive anybody of due process and equal protection. They had slavery in mind, and saying that you
Right.
can't discriminate against former slaves. And this somehow morphed into, protecting contraception and same-sex marriage.
Yeah. Well,
And
look, the best decision would have been not we're gonna reverse Roe and send it back to the states. They could have just said, actually, you know what? Science has made it abundantly clear. Technological advances over the last 50 years made it abundantly clear that life begins at conception, and so children in utero are fully human, and therefore persons worthy of legal protection.
right, right. I think it was. I think it's Rand Paul has
Yeah.
been trying to do that at the federal level, saying,
Good.
saying that because the 14th Amendment, no person shall be deprived of equal rights.
That's right.
And if you simply say, and a fetus is a person, an unborn human
Right.
being is a
Right.
person, then that stands the 14th Amendment argument on its head.
That's right. I mean, you're a doctor. I know you're not a biologist, so you probably can't tell us what a woman is. But as a doctor, how else would you declare when a child becomes a person?
Yeah, I mean it's clear. It sort of gets back to the whole ridiculous. What is a woman? Well, a woman is a woman
Right.
because chromosomally she has two X chromosomes as far as
Yeah.
her, and a human is a human because they have 46 pairs of chromosomes, and that comes about when a human sperm, unites with a human egg at conception. And so you really can't draw the line anywhere else as to when does life begin, when does human life begin.
Right.
And anytime you try to get into, a conversation about what is a person something different than a human being, then you just get into a whole lot of subjectivity in it, and you get the kind of morass that we've had for the past 50 years in trying to invent different rights and invent different ways to define what a human being is. So I think it's interesting that you bring up Obergefell, because if Justice Thomas was giving us a roadmap as to how you would unwind all of this, it would probably have to start. It wouldn't initially go back to contraception, since that's so embedded in our culture now. But I think going to something more recent, which is the Obergefell decision in same-sex marriage, which was absurd on its face from the very beginning. I would like to see somebody somewhere challenge that on the basis of this recent decision. Do you think? What do you think about whether or not that sort of an approach would fly?
Well, I mean, I think you would probably need, again, taking sort of the model the pro-life movement is used. You'd need a conservative pro-marriage state to bring suit somehow. You've got 30 or 31 states that have state constitutional amendments.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could have the state decide, we're going to start enforcing that constitutional amendment because we believe, based on the Dobbs decision, that Obergefell was wrongly decided. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing to just kind of throw out there and let
Sure.
people give that some thought.
Well, I mean, and like the Roe decision, the courts and the elites thought that they were going to settle the issue and
Yes,
people would move on, and of course that did not happen.
right.
And we must not let that happen with Obergefell and the marriage decision either.
Yeah,
I think there's more of a temptation to do that and a risk of doing that, because that's what it feels like right now. Hopefully it doesn't take 50 years to undo Obergefell.
yes,
The
right,
important thing is to not let that controversy die. That fight
exactly.
isn't over. In
Right.
many ways, like Churchill said, this is not the end. not even the beginning of the end when it comes to the marriage fight. Perhaps it's just the end of the beginning.
Yeah. Well, getting coming from a national perspective to a more local perspective, we have a long way to go in Massachusetts because Roe v. Wade is gone, but Massachusetts has already codified Roe and went actually beyond Roe, and very sneakily, in a lame duck session the day after Christmas, had the so-called Roe Act. And could you just could we talk about that a little bit and why that was even more egregious than Roe v. Wade?
Formally passed on December 29th, I believe, of 2020, which for Catholic and Orthodox friends was the Feast of the Holy Innocents.
Yes.
Commemorating the slaughter of the children at the hands of Herod. Again, and many of the people voting for it professing to be Catholic. So, very, very tragic on a number of levels. But what essentially what this law does, we've referred to it as the Infanticide Act. And we do that because one of the major things it does, in addition to lowering the age at which you can get an abortion without any parental consent from 18 to 16, is it eliminated language that was on the books that required doctors to provide life-saving care to children who are accidentally born alive.
Yeah.
It's hard to even sort of wrap your head around. I mean, as a doctor, maybe you understand it better, but if during the course of an abortion a child makes it out of the birth canal before it can be killed in utero, which, so the natural process can kind of take over, a child comes out. At that point, the doctors are no longer required by law in Massachusetts to render life-saving care.
Yeah, that's right.
So you enter this gray area where, it's not as if they're actively killing the child because they don't need to. Typically at 23, 24, 25 weeks, it's certainly sooner. If a child comes out of the womb, they're not going to make it without a lot of intense help. And so as former Governor Northam of Virginia said, who himself was a pediatrician, on a radio interview discussing a similar bill, that at that point, if a child is born alive accidentally, at that point a conversation would ensue.
Yes,
his words, between the mom and the doctor.
Right.
Well, at that point, you have a live child outside the womb who, even in Elizabeth Warren's America, is a human person, with all the rights and that entails. So the only conversation you're having at that point is whether you're going to commit passive infanticide.
Yeah, and that's right, and they don't come right out and say it. They're always trying to be sneaky about it, and they change the law subtly from the old law saying if a baby is accidentally born alive, and like you said, it's hard to even say those words, accidentally born alive, you have to resuscitate that's the old law. You have to resuscitate that baby. Now they say you have to have resuscitation equipment in the room.
Right, they left that in there.
Yeah,
there's no requirement that they have to use it.
There's no requirement that they have to use it, which is absurd and very sneaky. And
for what purpose would you eliminate that requirement? From the law.
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't as if they were just repealing the whole law and didn't put that back in. They specifically eliminated that language.
Yeah, and likewise, they insert language of, well, in the third trimester, you can abort for fatal fetal anomalies.
Right. Well, they're even trying to expand that now.
And they're right. They're trying to expand that to from fatal to severe. Right. And that's even irrelevant.
Yes, I've heard some people say that would then mean it'd be easier to include kids with things like Down syndrome.
Exactly.
So it's not fatal. So
exactly, and they still have the so-called health language in there, so that they could also They could also say, well, the mother's depressed, and therefore for her mental health, we need to do this third trimester.
And that's what I spent, I think, over a year trying to explain, is that, look, this language of fatal fetal anomalies, which the pro-aborts love to use, because everyone kind of gets scared. It's like if you say rape, incest, and fatal fetal anomalies, the pro-lifestyle will just huddle up like a turtle in a shell and be quiet, because those things are scary.
Yeah.
And, the reality is, rape and incest are less than 1% of all abortions. And incest, they just like using that because it's a dirty word. But there's no go back to a word file. There's no consensual adult sexual behavior that the liberals will condemn. So if it's an adult father with an adult daughter, they're not going to say anything against it. And if it's an adult father with a minor daughter, it's statutory rape. So they're just talking about rape. They threw the word incest is redundant to them. And rape, as tragic as that is, I've got a very, very close family friend who was adopted and later in life met his birth mom and learned that he was conceived in rape. And his life is no less valuable because of how he was conceived. And fatal fetal anomalies in this bill, completely unnecessary language because, as you point out, they've already got a loophole big enough to drive a Mack truck through.
Exactly.
With the emotional well-being of the mom.
Mm-hmm. And actually,
they'd like to put those scary words in there so they can.
Right. It's just an attempt to obfuscate the whole matter. And and speaking of rape and incest, I always like to say, well, who is the victim here? Who is the perpetrator of the evil? It is the rapist. It is the person who commits incest. It's not the baby. And yet the solution to rape and incest in the pro-abort's mind is to kill the innocent victim and harm the other innocent victim who happens to be the mother.
Well, that's the thing. In Massachusetts, if a woman is raped and a child is conceived, only one person legally can receive the death penalty, and it's not the rapist.
Yeah, exactly. And also the rapist or the person committing the incest can be the one who takes a 16-year-old, for instance, to the abortion clinic. There's no parental consent. There's not even a judicial bypass anymore. So that the only adult who needs to be informed of this 16-year-old wanting an abortion is the abortionist, or perhaps the rapist who brings her, or the sex trafficker who brings her. So it's so horrible on a number of levels, and we've got a lot of work to do. This concludes part one of my conversation with Andrew Beckwith, president of Massachusetts Family Institute. For more information about Massachusetts Family Institute, go to mafamily.org. And tune in next time when we will speak more about the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the satanic backlash that is occurring at pregnancy resource centers across the country, including right here in Massachusetts. And until next time, remember, we should always treat life with care and respect. And at the very least, we should first do no harm.
First Do No Harm with Dr. Mark Rollo is produced at WQPH 89.3 FM Shirley, Fitchburg. We are very happy to share it with other networks.
Thank you for tuning in to First Do No Harm. Dr. Rollo welcomes your questions and comments. You may contact him at markrollo978@gmail.com. That's MARKROLLO978@gmail.com. Thank you, and until next week, remember, first do no harm.